Wyoming Territory, October 1887, thunder cracked so hard it rattled the rafters of the old ranch house, and Victor Sutton nearly dropped the tin cup of coffee in his hand. He had not spoken a full sentence to another soul in 3 days, and he liked it that way. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest town and twice that from anything resembling society, a man could live quiet. He had built his own fences, trained his own horses, and buried his own grief. That was enough. The knock came again, sharp, desperate, soaked in rain. Victor set the cup down and reached for the Winchester leaning beside the door. He opened it slowly. A woman stood there, soaked through, shivering, with a baby wrapped in a thin wool blanket clutched tight to her chest. Her face was pale, lips trembling, dark hair plastered to her cheeks. The baby let out a soft cry, weak and tired. "I need help," she said, her voice cracked. "Please, just for the night." Victor looked past her. The rain was coming down in sheets, pounding the dirt hard enough to turn it to mud in minutes. Her boots were caked in it already. He looked at the baby, then back at her. "You can come in," he said, "but only for the night." She stepped inside, teeth chattering. He shut the door behind her and bolted it. The woman stood there for a moment, unsure, dripping onto his wood floor. The baby whimpered again. "You got a fire?" she asked. He nodded and pointed to the hearth. "There." She moved toward it, crouched low, and opened her coat to give the baby more warmth. Victor watched her carefully. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, but something in her eyes looked far older. Worn. Like someone who had seen too much, he finally spoke. "Name's Victor Sutton." She looked up at him. "Lydia Nolan, that's my son, Peter." Victor nodded once. "You runnin' from someone?" She hesitated. Yes, he waited, but she did not say more. That was fine with him. He was not one to pry. He brought her a dry quilt and laid it over her shoulders. She flinched when his fingers brushed her arm, but she did not pull away. "Thank you," she whispered. Victor walked to the stove and grabbed the kettle. "You want tea?" "Yes, please." He poured hot water into a mug and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, cradling it like it was the only thing holding her together. Peter stirred again, and she rocked him gently. "He is just a year old." Victor crouched near the fire, staring into the flames. "That baby's cold, you both are." "I had nowhere else to go," she said. The stage broke down 15 miles back. "I walked the rest." "In this storm?" he asked, eyebrows lifting. "I did not have a choice." Victor knew the tone in her voice. It was not drama, it was truth. Whatever she had run from had teeth. "You got family out here?" he asked. "No." "Not anymore." Victor ran a hand through his hair, already regretting what he was thinking. "You can stay longer than a night, until the storm clears, or longer if you need." Lydia looked up at him, startled. He stood. "I will get you both something dry to wear." She did not answer, but he saw the way her shoulders eased just a little. Victor found one of his old shirts and a pair of clean trousers. They would swallow her, but it was better than soaked skirts. For Peter, he found a soft flannel cloth and a dry blanket. He brought them back and handed them over without a word. She took them quietly. "There is a washroom in back. Wood stove in there too." Lydia stood, careful not to wake Peter, and walked to the back of the house. Victor stared at the fire. He had said it himself for years he would never marry. Too much trouble, too much risk, too much to lose. But when she had looked at him just now, standing in his doorway soaked and shaking, something in his chest had shifted. He felt it like a door creaking open, slow and uncertain. When she returned, dressed in his clothes, her hair still damp but her eyes clearer, he saw her, not just a woman with a baby, but a woman with strength, with fight, and with something aching beneath the surface. She walked closer. "Do you mind if I sit?" He pointed to the chair near the fire. Lydia sat carefully, Peter asleep in her arms. She looked up at Victor. "I know you did not ask for this. I will be gone as soon as I can." Victor shook his head. "I do not want you out there alone." "Not with a baby." Something passed between them then, not love, not yet, but a kind of understanding. "I have not had a real night's sleep in weeks," she admitted. "I keep waking up, thinking someone's coming after us." Victor leaned back against the wall. "You can rest here." "No one is getting past me." Her eyes searched his face, looking for something solid to hold on to. "You don't even know us," she said. Victor's voice was quiet. "I know enough." Lydia looked down at Peter, then back up again. "Thank you," he nodded once. That night, Victor laid a pallet near the fire for Lydia and the baby. He stayed up a while, rifle across his lap, listening to the storm fade into silence. He had lived alone for nearly a decade. No wife, no children, said he never would. But as he watched the small rise and fall of Lydia's chest, her son curled close to her, something in him cracked wide open. He did not know what it was yet, but it felt like the start of something he had never let himself want, and it felt a lot like hope. Morning came with a pale light dripping over the horizon, seeping through the frost-fogged windows. Victor stood at the pump behind the house, drawing water into a bucket, his breath hanging in the air. The storm had passed, but the ground was slick and heavy, and the wind carried a bite that said winter wasn't far off. Inside, Lydia sat near the hearth with Peter in her lap, her hair dry now, brushed back in a single loose braid. She watched the flames, her fingers gently patting the child's back in a rhythm that seemed older than words. She hadn't asked for breakfast, hadn't asked for anything at all, but Victor made biscuits just the same. He figured a woman who walked 15 miles carrying a baby didn't do much asking unless she had to. "You ever worked cattle?" he asked, setting a tin plate down on the table beside her. Lydia looked up. "No, my brothers did. I kept books for a feed store in Kansas City before I married." Victor pulled up a chair across from her. "You're used to numbers then." "I was," she said, voice lower now. "I haven't written anything down in a long while." Peter stirred against her shoulder, mouth working in his sleep. Victor kept his eyes on the boy a moment longer, then reached for one of the biscuits. "I've got 3 steers need tending out back. Fence lines holding, but won't be for much longer." Lydia nodded slowly. "You want me to help?" "I didn't say that, but you're offering me shelter." "I'd rather earn it." Victor chewed a moment before answering. "You know how to use a hammer?" She gave a slow nod. "My father was a carpenter, taught me before he passed." He set the biscuit down. "Then I'll show you the fence line after breakfast." The boy let out a sudden cry, sharp and needy, and Lydia rose without hesitation, shifting him in her arms and walking toward the washroom. Victor stayed seated, listening to her low humming behind the door, the kind of tune meant more for comfort than melody. He hadn't meant to speak so much. Most days passed with only the sound of hooves and his own breath. But something about her words, quiet, precise, cut through the silence without disturbing it. She carried herself like someone who didn't need rescuing, just room enough to stand. When she returned, Peter fed and calmer, Lydia paused near the window, watching the wind stir through the last of the yellowing cottonwood leaves. "What happened to your wife?" she asked, not turning. Victor crossed his arms. "Never had one," she blinked, surprised. "But this place, it's built for more than one man," he shrugged. "I built it that way before I knew better." Lydia didn't press. She only stepped away from the window, settling Peter back into the cradle Victor had fetched from storage earlier that morning. It had belonged to a neighbor's child, long buried now, but it still rocked fine. "I was married 2 years, she said after a long pause. "He died of fever last spring." Victor met her eyes but didn't speak. She sat again, took another bite of biscuit, then wiped her fingers on her skirt. "He was a kind man, but he had debts I didn't know about. When he passed, they came looking for payment." Victor's jaw tightened. "Did they touch you?" "No," she said softly, "but they would have, if I hadn't left." The room settled into stillness again, the kind that didn't feel heavy, just full. Victor stood and grabbed his coat from the peg. "We'll walk the west fence first," he said. "You'll want boots." Lydia didn't hesitate. She bundled Peter in the cradle, then pulled on the pair Victor had left by the door. They were too large, but she stuffed rags into the toes and rolled the cuffs of her trousers. She followed him out into the chill, the earth damp beneath their steps. They moved in silence for a while, boots squelching through the softer places. Victor showed her the cracked post near the ravine where last winter's runoff had torn a groove through the fence line. She examined it with a practiced eye and picked up the mallet without asking. "You've done this before," he said. Not with cattle, she answered, driving the nails in steady, even strokes. But wood is wood. He watched her work as the wind cut through the trees, watching the way her hands didn't tremble, not even with the cold. After they finished the fence, they walked back slowly, Lydia brushing her hands on her trouser legs. You said you never married, she said. But did you ever come close? Victor hesitated, then shook his head. There was a girl once, before the war. But I enlisted, and by the time I returned, she'd married someone else. Lydia didn't speak again until they reached the house. Sometimes I think we're all just carrying the things we never got to finish, she said. Victor held the door open for her. Sometimes. Inside, Peter was still asleep. Lydia knelt beside him, adjusting the blanket around his legs. Victor poured water into the basin, scrubbing the dirt from his hands. The light was fading already, the kind of shortening day that made every hour count. I'll fix stew, he said. You like venison? She smiled faintly, the first time she had, and it changed her face. I do. He turned away, but not before he saw the way her eyes lingered on him, not bold, not searching, just steady, like she was trying to decide if trust could grow in a place like this. Victor moved to the stove, but he felt it settle in him, the quiet shift of something beginning. Not sudden, not sharp. Just a slow thaw, like spring under snow. The first snow came quiet, drifting down without ceremony 3 days after Lydia had arrived. It gathered on the eaves and softened the ruts in the yard. Muffling sound until the only thing Victor could hear was the ticking of the stove and Peter's soft breathing as he napped in the cradle near the hearth. Victor stood at the window, one hand resting on the rough-hewn frame, watching flakes settle on the corral posts. Lydia was outside, hauling kindling from the shed with sleeves rolled and a scarf tied around her head to keep the wind from her ears. She walked steady, like someone who didn't expect help but wouldn't refuse it either. He opened the door and called out, "Leave that, I'll finish it." She didn't stop. "I already stacked the last row. Just bringing in what's dry." Victor stepped aside as she passed through the doorway, her arms full of split pine. The smell of fresh bark followed her in. "I was thinking," she said, setting the wood beside the stove, "you could let me keep the ledger for the stock and supplies." Victor reached for his coat. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," she said, brushing snow from her skirt. "If I'm here, I ought to be useful." He studied her a moment, then nodded once. "There's a ledger on the shelf by the back room, been meaning to update it." She moved toward it without another word, pulling the worn book down and thumbing through the pages with a practiced motion. Victor watched her lean over the table, lips parted slightly as she read, a look of quiet concentration that stirred something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not just admiration. A wanting, deep set and calm that had nothing to do with need and everything to do with her. "I'll fix the hinges on the barn door before dusk," he said, more to ground his thoughts than anything else. Lydia didn't look up. "You'll need help holding the frame steady," he hesitated. "You offering?" She glanced at him then, eyes steady. "I'm not much for sitting idle." They worked until the light began to thin, hands numb and boots slick with melting snow. Lydia held the door in place while Victor hammered in the new iron strap. Wind bit at their faces, but neither of them spoke of the cold. When they stepped back inside, Peter was stirring from his nap. Lydia moved to pick him up, murmuring softly as she wrapped him in the wool shawl. Victor poured hot water from the kettle into the basin and offered it to her. "You can wash up first," she nodded, dipping her hands into the steam. "Do you ever go into town?" "Once a month," he said. "For salt, nails, flour, sometimes mail." She glanced over her shoulder. "You keep to yourself." "I do." She dried her hands on a cloth. "Why?" Victor leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Folks talk. And I've seen what happens when a man lets too much in." Lydia rocked Peter gently. "I know what that's like." "You planning to stay?" he asked, the words coming before he had time to weigh them. She looked at him, really looked, and for a moment neither moved. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "But it's the first time I've felt safe since spring." He nodded slowly. "You don't have to decide today." She set Peter down again, his eyes already closing. Victor turned toward the stove, lifting the lid from the pot he'd set to simmer earlier. "There's rabbit stew if you're hungry." "I'm always hungry these days," she said, easing into the chair nearest the fire. He ladled 2 bowls and handed her one. She took it carefully, fingers brushing his as she did. It wasn't much, that touch, but it stayed with him longer than it should have. They ate in the quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of logs settling in the hearth. Afterward, Lydia leaned back, resting her head against the chair. "Do you remember what it was like before the war?" Victor's gaze lingered on the flames. "I remember the smell of wet grass after a storm. And my mother's voice when she sang to the milk cow." She smiled faintly. "I remember my father's boots on the porch. I used to wait for that sound." He looked at her then. "You want that again, a home like that?" She didn't answer right away. "I want something honest, doesn't have to be easy." "Just real." Victor nodded. "That's a good thing to want." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It held something growing, slow and steady like roots taking hold under snow. Peter stirred again, and Lydia rose to tend him. Victor watched her move, the care in her hands, the steadiness in the way she touched her son's cheek. He'd seen that kind of strength before, but never so close, never in someone who looked at him without judgment. He cleared his throat. "There's a spare room." "I haven't used it since my brother passed. It's yours if you want it." She turned, surprised. "Are you sure?" He held her gaze. "I wouldn't offer if I wasn't." Lydia's voice was quiet. "Then yes." "I'd like that." Victor nodded once, then turned toward the cupboard, hands busy searching for a clean blanket, but his thoughts were far from the linen. They were with her the way her presence settled into the house without displacing anything, like she'd been meant to fit there all along. He didn't say it aloud. Not yet. But in that moment, as snow thickened outside and warmth filled the small space they shared, Victor knew something had shifted for good, not a rescue, not an obligation, something else, something he wanted to last. By the second week, the rhythm between them had begun to settle. Not into routine, not quite, but something close enough to live with. Lydia rose early, swept the hearth, and fed Peter before the sun reached the ridge behind the barn. Victor handled the heavier work. The cold mornings made his knee stiff from an old injury, but he never let it slow him in front of her. Pride, maybe, or something quieter than pride but just as stubborn. They didn't speak much over breakfast, but there was no weight in the silence. Lydia had taken to setting a small pot of beans to soak near the stove each night, and Victor noticed she always left the tin of coffee within his reach without saying a word about it. One morning, as he repaired the latch on the chicken coop, Lydia stepped out with Peter bundled tight on her hip. She leaned against the fence, watching Victor work. The wind tugged at the ends of her braid. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" she asked. Victor didn't look up. "Thought about it once, after my brother died." "Why didn't you go?" He tightened the screw on the hinge. "Didn't see the sense in starting over where nobody knew me." Lydia shifted Peter to her other side, his hand curled in the wool of her shawl. "I used to dream about San Francisco," she said. "I saw a sketch of the harbor once in a Christmas paper. It looked like the kind of place where nobody asked where you came from." Victor stood, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Maybe that's true, or maybe everybody's just better at pretending." She smiled, faint, and stepped toward the gate. "Have you ever seen the ocean?" "No, I'd like to," she said. "Not because I think it'll solve anything, just to know how wide it really is." Victor opened the gate for her. "If you ever go, don't go alone." Lydia looked up at him. "Would you come?" He didn't answer right away. "I might." She nodded, then walked toward the house with Peter resting against her. Victor watched her go, the sway of her steps easy and sure. He hadn't meant to say what he did, but it sat right in his chest. That afternoon, she brought out the mending basket and sat on the porch while he split logs. She stitched a tear in the lining of his coat without asking, her needle moving clean through the wool. "You always work with your hands?" Victor asked, stacking the last of the wood. "I tried teaching once," she said. "Back in Missouri, just for a season. The boys never listened and the girls were too shy to speak. I liked it, though." "You miss it." "I miss the quiet between things." The part where you know you're doing something useful. Victor sat on the step beside her, arms resting on his knees. You've been doing that here. She didn't look at him. It's different. How? This isn't just surviving, it feels like building. Victor leaned back, stretching out his legs. I never thought I'd be building anything again, not after the war, not after my brother. Lydia's hands stilled in the fabric. You don't talk about him. No reason to, he's gone. She set the coat in her lap. What was his name? Illy. He expected her to say something else, but she only nodded and went back to stitching. Victor watched the thread pull tight through the seam. Her fingers were red from cold, but she didn't flinch. That night after supper, Lydia stayed up with him by the fire while Peter slept in the next room. She sat across from him, legs tucked beneath her, and watched the flames dance against the stone. I used to hum to Peter when we were on the road, she said quietly. It kept him calm. I think it kept me calm, too. Victor looked over at her. Why'd you stop? It felt foolish, singing in someone else's house. He shook his head. Nothing foolish about making a child feel safe. She was quiet for a while, then, just above a whisper, she started humming. Not a song Victor recognized, but it carried something warm in it, something that filled the space between them. When she stopped, he said, Don't let this be someone else's house. Lydia's eyes met his. What do you mean? I mean, if you want it, it can be yours too. She didn't answer right away. She looked toward the fire, then toward the doorway where Peter lay sleeping. I want to believe that, she said at last, but I've never stayed anywhere long enough to know how. Victor leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Then stay long enough to learn. Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with something deeper recognition, maybe, that he wasn't offering charity. He was offering ground, solid and earned. She reached across the space between them, her hand settling lightly over his. It wasn't a promise. Not yet. But it was the beginning of one. Victor set the last of the nails into the new paddock gate just after noon, his hands raw from the cold. The sun hovered low, casting long shadows over the snow-packed yard. Nearby, Lydia helped Peter toddle over a worn wool blanket laid near the porch. The boy had taken to standing on his own, legs uncertain but curious, and Lydia stayed close, her gloves off so she could steady him with bare hands. Victor watched them a moment longer than he meant to, then grabbed his gloves from the fence post and walked toward the house. Inside, a parcel waited on the table, brown paper, twine knotted tight. He'd picked it up from town 2 days before but hadn't opened it. It came from a feed supplier, but tucked inside, beneath the inventory list, was something else. A letter from a neighbor, Mrs. Dory Lee, who ran the schoolhouse 16 miles east. She had written to ask whether Victor knew anyone who might be willing to step in as a part-time assistant come spring. Her usual helper had married and moved to Cheyenne. Victor folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket. That evening, Lydia set a kettle to boil while Victor cleaned the mud from his boots near the back door. There's a woman in town, he said, runs the schoolhouse. She's asking after help. Lydia turned from the stove. She asked if I knew anyone. He paused. Thought maybe you'd want the name. Lydia's eyes stayed on the fire a moment. I haven't taught in a long time. She said she needs help just twice a week. Reading, mostly. Peter stirred in his cradle. Lydia picked him up gently, resting him against her shoulder. If she'd have me, I might like that. Victor nodded. I'll write her back. He stepped into the main room and stoked the fire. Peter's soft coos carried from the kitchen, and Lydia's low voice followed, telling him about the worn pine floors of her childhood home and how the sound of rain on the roof used to make her feel safe. Victor didn't interrupt. He listened, thinking how her voice had become part of the house without him realizing when or how. Later, Lydia sat beside him in the rocker, Peter asleep in her arms. She looked toward the window where wind pressed against the glass. There's something I should tell you, she said. Victor waited. When I left Kansas City, I took something that didn't belong to me. A man who claimed debt from my husband. He had no right to it, not in truth, but I knew he'd come after me if I stayed, so I took what I needed for Peter and I fled. Victor didn't shift or speak. The fire popped and Lydia went on. It wasn't much, $20 and a ring, I left the rest. Victor spoke low. You were protecting your son. I was afraid, she said. But I didn't want to build a life with lies in it. You're not lying now. She looked at him then, the weight of it all laid bare in her eyes. I want to stay, Victor, if you still want that. He reached over and brushed one thumb along the back of her hand. I do. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The next day, Victor hitched the wagon and rode with her and Peter to Mrs. Dory Lee's. The schoolhouse stood plain but well kept, and Lydia stepped inside with her chin steady and her coat buttoned tight. She returned half an hour later with pink in her cheeks and a slip of paper in her hand, terms and schedule. She'd begin in 3 weeks, once the new supplies arrived. The following Sunday, Victor drove them into town again, this time to the small white chapel with the warped roof shingles and the minister who'd buried his brother years before. They stood before him in the quiet morning light, just the 3 of them and Peter in Lydia's arms. No music, no crowd. Just words that held. Afterward, Victor pressed a ring into Lydia's hand forged, plain gold, warm from his pocket. I meant to give you this sooner, he said. She slid it onto her finger, her lips parted in a breath that caught somewhere between joy and disbelief. I didn't think I'd ever have this, she whispered. Victor touched her cheek. It's yours now. That night, after Peter had fallen asleep in the cradle by their bed, Lydia lay beneath the quilt with Victor's arms around her. Her fingers traced the lines of his shoulder, slow and quiet. I used to wonder what it would feel like, she said, to have a place where no one waited to take something from me. He kissed the place where her neck met her jaw. Now you don't have to wonder. She turned to face him fully, eyes dark in the lamplight. I love you. Victor didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, then kissed her gently. When he pulled back, he said, You and Peter, you've made this house into something I never thought I'd have. They slept with her hand curled against his chest and snow falling quiet outside. Years passed, and the house filled with more laughter, more footsteps. Peter grew sturdy and strong, helping Victor mend fences and check the water lines each spring. Lydia taught at the schoolhouse 2 days a week and kept a garden that ran wild with herbs and squash vines. They added a second cradle eventually and a third, and the house stretched to hold them all. Victor never left Wyoming. He didn't need to. His world had come to him. And in the hush that came each night once the children were tucked in, and the lamp was turned low, he would lie beside Lydia, her head on his shoulder, and know he had built something better than peace. He had built a life.